education, gender equity, energy, climate, and sustainable development with peace and justice for all. You represent many different types of organizations, non-governmental organizations, high schools, colleges, business, former UN staff and consultants, UN association members, and I think that the conversation is going to be really rich and rewarding. I'm very happy that Dr. Corinne Whitaker, an international development consultant, is here, and Ryan Kaminsky, who is program manager for the Human Rights and Special Initiatives at the UN Foundation. And he has generously come in to talk in place of Corinne White. What am I saying? Chanteclair Lantos Sweat, who was going to come up from Washington and then at the last minute could not. I especially want to thank Professor Osler for having us and for making this wonderful space available to us, and for the board members of the Southern New York State Division who have been involved in planning the program. You'll meet a number of them today. They're mainly the program facilitators and come with different areas of expertise. Thanks also to students from the SUNY Global Engagement Program, from Adelphi University, Columbia University, and a special thanks goes to Dr. Brenda Smith, to Linda Bagley, who is president of the Zeta Nu Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority based in Westchester, and they are the ones who are bringing 15 high school students from Mount Vernon, whom we will see shortly. In the past year, UNA has mobilized its members to hold meetings similar to this one to consider the world we want. Based on the work of our division and 11 other chapters and divisions around the country, UNA USA produced a document called An American Conversation on the Post-2015 Development Agenda. And that's available online, and I can direct you there. And that was given to the Secretary General earlier this year. The conversations that we are part of respond to a growing call for active participation in shaping the world we want. And it represents an extraordinary effort to engage people all around the world on these priorities. These consultations provide evidence and perspective to the diplomats and government officials who represent the countries of the world about the challenges people face in improving their lives and those of their families and communities. And unlike the past with Millennium Development Goals, and I think Corinne will address this, we're now talking also about here at home in the US and what we're interested in. After Corinne speaks, and then Ryan, I'll tell you a little bit about the process this morning in getting together at roundtables. And then we'll reconvene in this room after the roundtables to share our findings. Corinne?
And thank you to Charlotte. Assistance on this.
Charlotte, who is doing this, is now, as of next week, a VISTA volunteer, and she is going to be in Barrow, Alaska. So, a graduate of Cornell University, and in their agriculture and economics program. Thank you, Charlotte. And a long-term volunteer, an intern with the division.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to actually be part of this critical and very meaningful process. And it's an honor to be with those who offer a long and distinguished career in the areas that we're going to address today.
Let's wait just a moment, because I think we
Looks
have
like
our high school
Mount
Vernon is here. Brenda, Mount Vernon is here? Excellent. We're going to wait for them to come in.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody.
Scoot in over here.
Make it fit. I can move down. Okay.
Yep.
have to paper? Of course. Yeah, that's what
Tanzania and Nigeria, and has a doctorate in public health from Johns Hopkins University, knows the UN very well, and is a real expert, especially in issues relating to women, but generally development. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I started off just by saying I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to be part of this process. And there are among you those who have a long and distinguished career in all of this, and others who, while still in school, have committed yourselves to this global agenda and leading social change, and you are the ones who will lead it. So, I assume some of you have read some of the background material that was shared on the purposes, the principles, the processes, and the past and present and future as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. I just want to highlight a few key points and what makes these goals and this process different and really builds much confidence that this SDG effort will make a sustained difference in the world. And hopefully these points will help guide you in your own goal-specific discussions when we break into smaller groups. Please feel free to add or ask questions, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. We wanted to start with a little energy in the video.
The People's Climate March will take place 2 days before President Obama and world leaders attend a climate summit at the UN.
Climate change will bring more extreme weather, and action is now more urgent than ever.
Millions of people around the world gather in the largest.
That the defining the SDGs and using them as a tool to define and develop an international consensus around a set of goals and indicators to assure that all global citizens are healthy, safe, and educated, as well as a roadmap to get there, is characterized really by a new ethos of broad-based participation, inclusiveness, movement building, and frankly, a fair amount of excitement. Okay, that's it. Stay there. That's fine, thanks. In fact, in the UNA document that you have in your packets, we made note that the process of developing these goals was one of the most collaborative and inclusive policy processes in history. And that participatory process was also informed by the participation in other negotiations prior to these discussions, those around Rio and the environment, those around the reviews of Cairo and the population and development, and those around the women's agreement in Beijing. This is quite different from the process for formulating the Millennium Development Goals. The MDGs, which were outlined 14 years ago, were the original map for an overarching development plan, which took a step beyond the more sector-specific focus of conferences on environment, population, women, children. And the MDGs focused on several key technical and sector-specific interventions. It's a little hard to see here, but eradicating poverty and hunger, universal primary education, gender equality, child mortality, maternal health, HIV/AIDS, environmental sustainability, and participation for development. But you can go on to the next one. The vision and the impetus for the development of the MDGs emerged from the Millennium Declaration, negotiated and signed by the heads of state, seen here. The detailed goals and objectives were subsequently developed by a consortium of expert and technical task forces and expert consultations. And having been on the sidelines during the development of the MDGs and witnessing sometimes experts squabbling over what should be included where and what terminology should be used, I can attest that this effort around the SDGs is a sea change in how we develop a global vision. So the principles of participation, collaboration, inclusion, and a holistic approach, as well as a focus on the underlying fundamental factors such as gender equality and youth, the status of youth, are reflected in the goals themselves. And I wanted to just share an insight from a very well-known Latin American feminist activist, Mabel Bianco from Argentina, who has been involved with all of these agreements from time immemorial. And basically what she said was, we began by focusing our attention on changing policies at the global level. Then the MDGs forced us to focus on what was really happening at the national level. But when the women that we brought to testify before the UN on the issues around the MDGs spoke, we realized that the solution to their challenges was dependent on changes at all levels, right down to the municipal and popular levels, and thus civil society needed to be engaged in a very meaningful way. So we are here today to acknowledge the progress made on pursuing this roadmap, but also acknowledge its limitations and provide guidance for the U.S. on both priorities for a comprehensive, inclusive, and sustainable and operational plan for global development, the SDGs, and specific and measurable steps and actions which can be taken in this country to assure that the U.S. itself both abides by these agreements and supports other countries to do the same in its external relations with other countries. So how do you tell the difference between an MDG and an SDG besides the acronym? One thing that might help you is looking at the issue of women's empowerment. You have pages for each of the goals that you'll be working on that describe what the SDGs say and what their targets and goals are, as well as what the MDGs, how they've measured progress along those same lines as they relate to the MDGs. And I think in looking at it, in looking at the two of them, the differences between the two are immediately apparent. Women's empowerment, as an example, in the case of looking at the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, it really is important to examine the targets under the goal and the objectives. The targets are the outcomes measured, and they're assumed to be proxies for this much bigger goal of women's empowerment. The MDGs included a gender equality goal, and gender equality was also assumed to be cross-cutting and a fundamental precondition for the success of the other MDGs. But an insufficient focus on the fundamental and underlying factors, which work against equality and empowerment, undermine progress on many goals. The MDGs, with the results around women's empowerment, focused on education, political participation very narrowly defined as it related to the formal system, universal access to reproductive health. In the case of the SDGs, it's embraced ending all forms of discrimination, all forms of violence, harmful practices, addressing unpaid labor, sharing responsibilities within the household, full and effective participation at all levels of political, economic, and public life. So a much more holistic vision. Therefore, the lack of that big vision for the MDGs, it's not a surprise that one of the goals on which the least progress was made under the MDGs was maternal mortality and morbidity, because those issues are right at the core of all of that. So what are some of the key principles that we need to keep in mind as we offer our recommendations on the goals and targets, and most importantly, specific actions? Some of the key guiding principles I would put forward are sustainability, right? That's right out front in the description. We often think of sustainability as relating to assuring sufficient resource flows to keep efforts going. And it is very clear that the SDGs call for broad participation, not only in their formation, but also in their implementation and the continuation, i.e. all hands on deck. We need the governments, the civil society actors, the private profit sector, and even other non-state actors to be part of it. But money and technical assistance alone does not assure that effective and good practices identified by all the learning of the past decades and all the evaluations done will be continued, and that they will be sustained when those primarily responsible for sustaining them are the ever-changing, highly conflicted, and usually under-resourced state ministries of health, education, and public works. Therefore, the key contribution here, which also reflects a major change in the global mechanisms of focused on all the UN agreements, is accountability. The accountability of governments who are signatories and who have ratified the allied agreements. Accountability not only for spending money where it's needed, but for the programs and practices that were identified by the experts: sexuality education for youth, quality of services provided, sustained access to contraceptives. These qualitative dimensions also need to be carefully watched, and civil society are the actors to do that. Therefore, it does require an informed and active civil society with access to government oversight and monitoring mechanisms, supported by their global allies, such as the Human Rights Council or National Human Rights Councils. In the United States, it was the General Accounting Office, who could be watchdogs to help them get access to information that's hard for civil society to get access to at times. And it also requires sustained and strong civil society institutions who can respond immediately when there's an opportunity to engage, rather than having to rev up the machine and losing time. So, and the other key point of sustainability is the integral involvement of an informed next generation. Young people, both those who are here and those who will soon be actors on the stage, but also the subsequent generations who hopefully will have benefited from some of the changes that the SDGs can put in place in this country as it relates to learning about gender equality, human rights, and democracy. Another key principle is universal, and meaning that the SDGs reflect a grounding in international human rights, not just reducing mortality or suffering, and that the objectives outlined in these goals apply to all regions, countries, populations, ethnic groups, even when local contextual realities may not support them. There may be a need for some upfront work on normative change, on the issue of gender equality, for legal and policy change, on services provided, all of that in service of making sure that the goals and targets can actually be met universally. Another key principle is inclusive. And this really reflects a growing awareness of the need to track how discrimination and lack of equity and differences within populations, not just between populations, are key to reaching the goals. The most marginalized populations must be served, not just what is sometimes called low-hanging fruit, the easiest wins to get. It's not just the differences between Africa and Latin America, but the differences between South Africa and Guinea. It's not just the differences between rural and urban, but the differences between the lives of urban dwellers who have the greatest access to services, public services, whether they're wealthy or not, and those in migrant slums who have access to absolutely no services. It's not just the difference between northern and southern India, but between the Dalit and other castes. And it's not just differences between male and female adolescents, but responding to the heterogeneity of those groups. These female adolescents, are they in school, out of school? Are they married? Are they already mothers? These are all factors that need to be taken into consideration. And the final consideration is that any one individual has multiple identities, intersecting identities. So they may be a young female Dalit in a very poor region. So all of those affect their experience. But a failure to consider those differences leads not only to greater marginalization of some groups, but often to unintended consequences and some serious violations of human rights. And I think for those who have been following the Ebola epidemic, that alone demonstrates actually quite a degree in that women are 80% of the infections, 65% of the deaths, and that's an indication to us that something is not right. So I've summarized for you to consider in your discussions the key recommendations as to all hands on deck, accountability, integral involvement of the next generation, the universality of applying these, the inclusivity, who might be left out, and also finally not to lose sight of the fact that any one goal also relates to the other goals, particularly some of those with overarching issues such as gender. So thank you, and if people have any questions, we could have a little kind of question and answer. I don't know what, you're the time watcher, and I know we're running a little
Go
behind.
ahead. Are there any questions?
I guess not.
Okay, thank you. Do you all have a copy of this?
Engagement Center and our friends from AKA. It's wonderful having you all here, and I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion. I just really can't emphasize enough the perspectives from the previous speakers about the role of civil society, of us having a voice in the post-2015 development agenda. Over the past few years, and the study that has been cited a few times, UNA USA has worked with its members in chapters across the country to really make sure that Americans have a voice in this post-2015 development agenda, and we know what priorities Americans have for sustainable development and what areas are really important for Americans to look at. You could see that in this report from 2013. And part of that too is also making sure that America, the United States, is involved at the UN and showing leadership in the post-2015 development process. Because we not only want to replace the MDGs, which will sunset in 2015 with a new framework, we also want a transformative framework. And we want something that really can put us on the path to eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. And that's just one of the goals out of 17. So once more, UNA USA has done, with its membership, 33 consultations across the country. And as someone that goes to these meetings and tracks these meetings, I can say, when some ambassadors from different countries are a little, wary of some of the goals, they're a little skeptical, they say, well, how do we know these are universal? And the My World 2015 platform, the ballots you all have in your hands, are cited all the time saying this is universal. Our citizens have said they care about these issues, and these are the issues that we should all be thinking about and talking about and drilling down and making sure that they're addressed in the next 15 years. So I just wanted to say thank you all so much again for being here. What you're doing today will have an impact, and it'll dovetail efforts all across the country focused on the post-2015 development agenda. And that, I was coming to the meeting today from Brooklyn on the subway and trying to think of a good Halloween reference or joke to make on post-2015. Honestly, it didn't go very well, and I was really thinking about it. But just as today, anyone can be anything they want. Today, we can make sure that we make our voices heard for the world we want. So I'm so glad you're here. Thank you very much, and please have a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
So, the way that we're going to do this is, before the chaos starts, I want everybody knows their groups, right? Everybody knows what group they're going into?
I should say that the folks who came in were stuck in traffic.
Okay.
I brought them in without them registering, without them picking up anything.
No.
And I think also I'm interested in this because my parents are mental health clinicians and my sister is a nurse, so it goes with the territory.
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm a political science student at SUNY New Paltz, interning in the Foreign Policy Association this semester. I'm doing a research paper on water as a human right, so I figured this was the way to learn more about it. Hi, my name is Lindsay.
What high school are you in?
And what year are you? Ninth grade. Okay. And what's your favorite subject? Science. Okay. Next. To which high school?
In the Bronx.
Okay. And what grade are you, and what's your favorite subject?
10th, and global history.
Global history. Global history. Next.
Charlotte Emerzek, I graduated from Cornell in 2013, and I'm about to move to Alaska to start a program with Illisavic College and Tribal College on the North Slope, nutrition education and cooking classes for young families.
And you serve the community that way as a
My name is Victoria Saez. I go to Harvard
from New
University.
York.
I'm in the 11th grade, and my favorite subject is math.
Great. Good morning, I'm Cheryl Brandon.
My name is David
Founder
Stillman.
and CEO of Sisters and Sisters
I worked in the United Nations for 30 years, and for the past 10 years I've been in charge of a non-profit organization called the Public-Private Alliance Foundation. Our work is especially focused these days on improvement of cooking in Haiti, where charcoal has been denuding the country. Use of charcoal by so many people.
I'm actually from Switzerland.
Yes?
My name is Lauren Berry, and I attend Manhattan Center for Science and Math. I'm a senior last year. My favorite subject is pre-com.
I was so afraid of that stuff. Yes.
My name is Allison James. I am the Director of Education and Environmental Policy for one of the New York City City Council members.
Thank you all for joining us.
I'm a global engagement program student and I'm interning at the
If
Center
we would
for
all take
Reproductive
some
Rights.
time to look at this handout we have,
Well, now,
Ebola.
Greek calculus.
So I thought, it kind of ties
And,
in, because we're talking about
your field was
MDG6 here.
Math,
When we
wonderful,
are
wonderful. Okay, so,
looking at
we
malaria,
have
and this was
a,
crafted long before Ebola, but I think it kind
two
of
things that I want to bring to your
got
attention.
fit into the
Three
Ebola, as we can look here, that is to address the
national
infectious
disasters in all
disease,
countries.
code 6.
To
And
integrate
what we
climate change
talked
measures
about
into
here
national
is
policies,
have halted by
strategies and planning.
2015 HIV
To
AIDS
improve
and begin to
education,
reverse the spread of
awareness
HIV
raising,
AIDS.
human
So do you think
intellect,
this focus
institutional
not only on
capacity,
HIV AIDS
on
and
climate
throwing some
change
more food on the
mitigation,
table,
adaptation,
which is Ebola,
impact
do you
reduction,
think
and
we
early
need
warning,
to address, make sure
implement
this goal
the
6
commitment
of looking
undertaken
at
by
infectious
developed country
diseases
parties to the
is
UN
a
framework
part of the
for,
SDGs? That is my question.
climate change
Yes.
convention to a goal of mobilizing jointly
I think just we should
US $100 billion annually by 2020 from all sources to address the needs of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation and fully operationalize the Green Climate Fund through its capitalization as soon as possible. And then
Okay, so it's related to what you're saying, yes,
so
it's equal,
that's
it's
money,
related to
okay?
goal
And the
7.
last one is
Cheryl.
promote mechanisms
I
for
say
raising
yes, and I say
capacities
now
for effective
the
climate
flavor of
change
the month,
related
unfortunately,
planning
is
and
Ebola,
management
but who
in
knows
least
what the
developed
next flavor
countries,
of the month will be.
including focus
So I
on
think it's
women,
important that we
youth,
have an
local and
infrastructure, we have a
marginalized
process in
communities.
place to deal with
So the
whatever
reason
that
I
might be. But based
go
on
down
the
through
current
that
state,
list
we have
of
HIV
targets,
now. Clearly, we
there's
know
1, 2,
now
3,
the
4,
emerging,
5
not necessarily emerging, but
targets
the existing
is because
is Ebola.
now we need
So
to
it reemerging,
think about those
absolutely.
and
So
talk
that
about
being
them
the
in
case,
relation
I see that
to
there needs to be a sense of urgency.
the discussion that we heard this morning about, what are
Be a part of the Sustainable Development Goals,
is
because as we
from
know, next month,
communities and
today is the last day of October. Sometime next month, if they're on schedule,
So,
the Sustainable Development Goals will be released from the Secretary General's office.
some of the
So far, we do think it's important that Goal 6 is very much rolled over into SDGs, right? Correct.
has to do with
Absolutely, here if I feel otherwise. I think
adaptive capacity. And the
the
next one is
situation with Ebola is
policy,
illustrative of several things that
policies.
need to be taken
The
into
third one is
consideration in this
education.
SDG goal related to health. One is,
And
it is a
awareness
gendered
and
epidemic, women are
institutional
disproportionately
capacity.
affected.
And the fourth one
Secondly,
is
part of the
commitment.
reason we're facing this situation is Ebola has been in the past
Commitment of money
limited to the African continent, and since that's not a priority investment, we now see the situation before us, beginning in particular among those, it was when
and
Ebola
then
hit
the
Liberia and
last
Sierra
one
Leone,
is
which are
quality mechanism
politically important
for
actors
raising
that
capacities.
people took notice. I think it also illustrates the fact that you need a strong health system
raising
overall.
capacities for climate change,
Nigeria was able to
planning,
do what it did
and
because
development.
it was coordinated, it had
Including focus
in
on
place
women, youth,
a
local and marginalized
initiative
communities.
on ending
There.
polio, which is
Now,
a major issue in Nigeria, that was funded by Gates, and they just repurposed everything for
The,
Ebola. So they,
I'm very
and I
happy to
think that the
have
Nigerian
two
medical
people
community
here in
is very well
particular,
organized, and part of that is
because
based on some
I always
unhappy learning
talk
in the
about,
past, about
what is
what
climate
happens when they're
change
not.
likely to mean for
And I
me?
also feel that the way in which it's
sort of
articulated
joke
is
about
important
this very-
because it does
very serious
reference
thing, because,
all
we're-
and all
we're really-
ages.
we're really
Maternal
talking
mortality
about
issues begin
the
at the
whole
birth,
world.
before the birth
And
of a female child.
the,
And
the end of the world as we
it
know it.
uses the language ensure
We-
and
the
promote
news that we
well-being. That
see,
means
the
within
information
human rights
we get
language,
is
respecting,
that,
protecting, and promoting active,
serious
proactive,
things
anticipating
really
something
and
like
truly are
Ebola,
happening in our world,
anticipating
and they
just,
come about
some of the challenges.
because of
It's very, very important.
Article
16.2. Use and reliable and when you get up in the morning, every time you get up, you see what's happening. See what's happening. So unfortunately what happens, and that use of human rights.
By the way, 5A is pretty important. Access to these.
I mean, what you're saying is very
things like land.
and but I think until we get you're never And that's just my opinion. And one of the things that I see here is the traffic comments. I'm very active in anti-traffic in this country. And that's one of my issues. You know, the non-governmental organizations in the US. And 2 years ago, nobody wanted to hear this. Nobody. And now it's become so big in Washington, all over, trying to resist men as well as women. In other words, women are the ones being abused, okay? But unless men get on board, nothing's going to happen. But I mean, our particular addresses so much more. And I don't want to take all the time talking about my personal interests. I'd like to hear the rest of you.
The reform should be at the college level or at the
I was gonna say, we're talking about
state
state
level or?
I feel like, well, nationally, we should put some kind of like,
Guidelines or something, or standards?
A standard for all universities in America, you know, you have a girl in Columbia carrying around a mattress, they can't kick her rapist out of the school, or like penalize, you know, I think that's ridiculous.
Okay, so do you think they should be national standards or just guidelines?
I think there should be national.
I think there should be a national like standard, and then you can choose to go above and beyond that. But there needs to be something like a baseline.
Okay. So I guess what I'm saying is to. And I wonder if it just needs to be at colleges or
High school too.
Yeah.
It's getting anywhere.
Yeah, I think any institution.
We should have a high school dress code that's blaming girls. Like, oh, you can't wear leggings as pants. Like, that's how it was for me in high school.
So,
you know, like, oh, I'm not provoking.
I think that
Which is stupid because then they use the arguments like, well, it'll distract boys. Well, teach your sons not to be distracted, God forbid. Like,
You know, that's
cat calls.
which I think there's that.
So let's sort of keep, bring it up, bring it up to the United States, what should our federal government
I mean,
how do we increase?
how would we increase female decision makers in Congress? I mean, that's one thing we should think about. I don't know. I mean, in some countries, they legislate that a certain number, a certain percentage have to be women. Like in India, I think 30% of people at the local.
in Denmark too.
In Denmark, they could be a quota. But women will not teach them leadership.
Universal primary education by
Leadership and
2015.
policy.
Okay, but what we need to do is at least answer the question, why should this goal be included in the sustainable development goal? Why should it be? And then we need to hear from you, some of you, regarding that, and I
You can be who you want to be. You can get to this point. If you want to do this, you just work hard, you know.
and then we can still address what you indicated, maybe at,
I don't mind voting for a man.
somewhere else.
Or women,
What to share, to elaborate the issue on that. But right for
I think we
now.
should ask these two girls, what do you think? I mean, would there be something that could be included in your curriculum that would give women more of a boost to take political
Very simple.
action or be?
So many countries have not accomplished it by 2014.
And we're gonna have to record it, make note of that.
Many parents can't afford to send
Because these are unmet goals.
because of, under certain circumstances, they don't have a job or, so free education is important just because your parents cannot afford to send you to school. Does not mean that you should be allowed that. And if we want a future where globally, economically, we want a better economic world,
You have something like that?
be educated
We'll see, yeah, exactly.
I guess add is to the economic world. If you're thinking from an economic perspective,
How about something on
developed countries, not only
It's very controversial right now.
Southern Hemisphere. It's crucial to really. I don't know if your organization, my question would be to you, does your organization believe that a top-down approach of hunting down human trafficking, holding more harsher sentences, education, that approach, is there evidence of that approach working?
Safeguarded and they don't want to prevent anybody who might need it. At risk of climate change and so for example Bangladesh is sea level is rising quickly and people are very exposed to that threat.
Legislating a quota.
I went to a talk by
Immediately from
and she went to a trafficking conference and she was talking about learning things,
there's that conflict
like keeping your ears open. And there was a woman there who talked about selling her daughter so that the rest of the family could eat. And she cried, but she didn't. And she wasn't a dry eye in the house. And so
a lot of times sessions like this going on around the country. So you're part of a larger group, but what you're saying here is very important because here in the southern New York State area, you can act on what you're saying. You know, you can act in your hometown, you can act in your school, you can act online. So, that said, let's take the groups in order. May we ask for group 3, which is health.
I'm going to time you, so, but you have the timer right across from you, so you know there's going to be 5 minutes. Just because we're pressed for time, we can't have the groups go on after 5 minutes, right? So
We'll be
fast. No, I know you will, but don't, you know, rush it.
Why don't you come over on this side and
go ahead.
We'll get a better video.
By the way, a brief introduction, my name is Justin.
I'm Allison. Hi, everybody.
So, I do apologize because we both took notes separately and I'll be reading a little bit off here, but Allison, if you want to go ahead.
All right, so the main reason that we think our goals should be on the MSD goals for the upcoming 2015-2030 is we feel that, our group felt, that we need to be proactive in establishing infrastructure, a process, and an organized healthcare system in order to prevent infectious diseases and prevent the chaos that follows as we've seen with the Ebola outbreak. We also need to have a higher quality of life, and in order to have a quality of life, one of our major issues is infant mortality and maternal mortality. So in order to have a quality of life to begin with, you need to be alive past the age of 5. That's a good way to start. Health has been highly politicized in the past few years, and we need to hold the private sector as well as the public sector accountable. So we've discussed doing that through arguing that in order to be productive, you have to be healthy. If you don't have your health, you can't join the global workforce, you can't participate in society. So that is an incredible global impact, especially as we have a more globalized society. We've become more interconnected, we all rely on labor on a global level. So to hold the private sector accountable, we just have to point out, if you want a workforce, you need to promote global health. We also added that you need regulations, you need to have public stakeholders that hold corporations accountable. You need to look at corporate investments and not just leave it to moral shaming or that's it.
Yeah, and then so how we prioritize the specific targets within Goal 3. We kind of lumped in nutritious food and healthcare as interrelated, followed by education, which helps people out of poverty, creates awareness around the rights that people have to health, things of that nature. Followed by gender equality, so given the fact that if we don't have equality among women have equal pay, and we're all in this together, right? So this is a conversation that happens among women and men as well. As was brought to my attention very specifically. Followed by freedom from discrimination, which encompasses also gender equality and tolerance for all people. And then honest and responsible governments and creating the legal mechanisms which comes back to having, stakeholders at all levels, private and public, and political freedom as well, so that, the haves and the have-nots have, representation and have their voices heard, so that they're not marginalized.
All right. So what we think is most important in the United States is bringing affordable and nutritious food to all people. We have a country where we create some of the most food in the world, and we still have 1/6 of our population in food insecure homes, which we think is absurd. It's incredibly expensive. There are food deserts. We have inner city. The fact that we have food distribution problems is an incredible issue in the United States, so we think if we can bring it to a more micro level of food sharing and redevelop our food distribution systems, that would be an incredible benefit to the United States. We also think it's very important to introduce more political freedoms, or people need to engage those political freedoms that they already have. This is needed to create a more equal society, which encompasses our gender equality and freedom from discrimination. We need to stop discrimination in its tracks and create a free and fair political environment, which would be, a utopia, but we can work there.
And so what kind of obstacles do we see in achieving the goal and the target specifically, which was more or less, governments and businesses being obstructionist, specifically businesses chasing profit and acting in self-interest, and we talked about how, basically creating a paradigm in which, people understand our interconnectedness around the world right here at home. That's a very important corporate social responsibility talking point. And then where do we actually find these stakeholders? What kind of coalitions do we build? How do we engage people? There were two different thoughts on this, one of which is the haves have what they need in order to go out and promote the needs of the have-nots, whereas one of our speakers had to say that in her personal experience in consulting, it's very important for the have-nots to speak from their perspective. And finally, what is the group's recommendation for action to mobilize? One is emphasize the role of youth and awareness for peer education. Two is focus on rights, so link democracy with human rights to the youth, and focus on global connectedness because we are interdependent. Thank you very much for your time.
And a special shout out to Justin and Allison. So the bottom line message we want to bring to the rest of our colleagues and partners in crime here is, without human rights and political freedom, you can't go forward. Thank you.
May we have group number 4, education.
I'm a member of the Global Engagement Program. I'm Jasmine, and we discussed universal education in our group. Okay, so the first question, why should this goal be included in the Sustainable Development Goals? One of the issues that we immediately brought up was so many countries haven't really met this goal by 2015, and so it's essential to redevelop this goal for the future. And to start off with this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, she once said, "This world really revolves to our youth. They will take over future management." So this education, it all depends on the youth. Another one is economic empowerment. So education is liberating not only politically, economically, but also advances gender equality. And another important aspect, education breaks the cycle of poverty. You can break the cycle of poverty in one generation. So on to the second question. Which targets from the ONWG document do you think are most important and why? So we wanted to dissect the first goal. It was 4.1. So this goal included primary, secondary, equitable, and quality education. So it's a really broad-based goal. So one of the issues we wanted to modify or separate goals to make them more specific. Another aspect, we wanted to, I think it was goal 4.3, linking education with jobs. So there are other means for advancing education. So thinking of a future prospect for education in schools. We also wanted to set the focus for secondary education. So primary education is important, but secondary education is also very important. And also we wanted to dissect the word quality education.
So how do we define quality education, especially in the developing world? And there must be a way of measuring this.
So as for how the U.S. can implement these kinds of policies, we think that first and foremost we should definitely rearrange the budget so education does receive more, because currently, as it stands, the U.S. only allocates about 5% of its budget to education versus the 25% that goes to the military, and that's just completely unjust, really, because the education really provides for the future. We also think that quality should be kind of regulated throughout the country, especially in the public sector, because you want to give the same opportunities to students throughout the country, and it shouldn't matter where they live and what economic situation they may be in. There should be more classes oriented for the future, maybe focusing on resume building and certain skills for vocations like computer technology advancement. And then there should also be a broader perspective of the world brought into the classroom, and maybe start global awareness at a younger age. And how we can even narrowly define that into like state and city policy. We should definitely just make sure that schools have enough books and supplies to be available for the students, and like budget cuts are a major issue right now. And we think that a lot of the money should go back into the programs that would definitely advance education and educational opportunities for the future. We also need to create an environment for a diverse students and different kinds of people, so you can be exposed to different cultures and maybe integrate more schools so you don't have just minority, majority, and there's these economic disparities and cultural issues that rise. So we definitely want to focus on those. Is that me? Oh.
Okay, so another question. What will be the obstacles to making progress on this goal at the global, national, and local levels? So start with global. Obviously that gender disparity mindset. That mindset has to shift. Also bad governance and corruption that's present throughout the world. And misplaced priorities. At the national level, maybe the de facto segregation of schools. And I know one of the high school students brought up, alright, I'll just speak to him after. So he brought up the idea of trying to engage students. Students are not interested in their schooling, they're not motivated to move on. So trying to engage students shows students that education is important for their future, it's essential to their future. And then at the state and local level, a lot of these ideas are cross-cutting. So instead of increasing resources to education, states are cutting them. So it's giving even less opportunities for kids at a younger age. And also states are eliminating programs that give the ability, that give students the ability to get hands-on work, the ability to become self-sufficient. So also budget cuts, it's a huge issue. And so another one, which stakeholders and coalitions will be important to engage in order to make progress on this goal and its targets. This is also the global, national, and state local level. So for the global level, we brought up the idea of celebrities. Using celebrities, NGOs, mentorships with NGOs, collaborations with organizations that provide free education online. National NGOs again, and getting more young people involved. And then for the state and local level, using community leaders and local governments, partnerships with NGOs and grassroots organizations, and getting more young people involved.
About gender come up.
I'd like to thank
yes.
quickly Nikki and Jasmine, who did a tremendous job. I don't know how they did so marvelously because we wanted to stay all day to discuss goals before. But thank you so very, very much.
Is May Vutra-Pampatana, and I'm representing New York University as well as myself and all women and individuals of the world. Why is women empowerment an important goal? Simply put, it affects all of us. Women, men, cis, trans, straight, LGBTQ individuals. It affects each and every one of us. Why is women empowerment important? Women make up 50% of the population. If we don't utilize half of our world's population, what does that mean for our country? We are losing out on capital, economic development, health, quality of life, and hence that is why women empowerment should be an important priority for the Sustainable Development Goals. In my committee today, we talked about different issues that affect women. For our recommendations for our group include reforming reproductive rights for all women and LGBTQ communities that are heavily marginalized, legislation for undocumented female workers, and to end sex and human trafficking in the world, national standards and guidelines for handling rape cases and violence against women, to provide resources to and support organizations like Planned Parenthood that support women's access to reproductive health, violence, and protection against violence, and sanctions against overt sexist behavior or discrimination by authority figures, not limited to teachers, professors, religious leaders, as well as supervisors and bosses. We're using New York City as a case study. We see this happen at a local level. In a developing nation like the United States, this is still a prevalent issue. For example, in New York City, we lack health education, sex ed education, for individuals in low-income neighborhoods of New York City. And coincidentally, no, not coincidentally actually, they are also those at the most high risk for new HIV/AIDS cases. States like New York City still need to pay and pass an equal pay legislation for both the city and state levels. There needs to be social services for undocumented female immigrants being exploited for domestic services or sex trafficking. New York City has one of the most heavily populated immigrant populations, and we need to do something about it to prevent them from being marginalized. Plan B and forms of contraception are still not free for those who cannot afford it, which marginalizes our health rights. And support for Planned Parenthood is still lacking, and funds are getting cut. And that is why women empowerment is important, because it affects all countries, all people, individuals, from developing nations like Thailand or Sudan, to developed first world nations like the United States. If we don't join as one, what will the world come to? And I end on this quote from Sheryl Sandberg. One day, there won't be women leaders, but just leaders, because we are all leaders in our way, and we need to be empowered enough to do and make change for all. Thank you very much.
And thank you to May for, we had a really good group and really good input, so thank you very much.
And energy, put some energy into their reports.
So hello everyone.
Pardon, do you want one of these?
Goal 7 and its energy to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern technology for all. So the first question is, why should this goal be included in the Sustainable Development Goals? We talked about how energy covers Maslow's hierarchy of need in the aspect of shelter. In developing countries, it affects how healthcare is provided. Energy is critical because it touches on many other things on the agenda, such as gender equality and maternal mortality. Energy is also needed for education, like providing lights and internet. And we also talked about technology transfers from developed to least developed countries. And we also agreed that energy is needed to sustain a minimal standard of living. So the second question, which targets from the document do you think are most important and why? And so the first one is 7A that we talked about, and it's by 2030 enhance international cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy research and technologies, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and advanced and cleaner fossil fuel technologies, and promote investment in energy infrastructure and clean energy technologies. And some of the reasons as to why we should support this aspect of the goal is because in least developed countries there's increased disparity between the haves and have-nots, and so technology transfer it's very important in that aspect, and having technology transfers and expansions of energy possibilities in these countries will help create more opportunities. And we highlighted that a lot of people resort to like in the informal economy. We also highlighted that it would improve security issues, increase investment, and encourage infrastructure in these developed countries. And we also highlighted that a lot of places in the U.S. are also off the major power grids. And then so the other aspect of this goal is 7B, and it's by 2030 expand infrastructure and upgrade technology for supplying modern and sustainable energy services for all in developing countries. And we said this would be important because, again, it supports education, and it would benefit countries that are vulnerable to natural disasters. And we pointed at Bangladesh because it's vulnerable to a lot of flooding. So next question, how do you think this target should be applied to the United States policymaking legislation, and what needs to be done to be integrated into national policies? So we identified lobbying, but from big companies, and we pointed out that we have to limit the impact that these special interest groups have on the way that Congress and the Senate votes. And a way of doing this is we need to see who are sponsoring political candidates. So having like the sponsors be visible in the campaign. And we also highlighted a Supreme Court ruling that allowed super PACs to allow for campaigning. And we also encourage more tax credits for clean energy, and overall we encourage like political awareness at the state level and municipal level, so that people are aware of elections and who are the people on the ballots and what they stand for. Sorry, hold on. The next question, which stakeholders and coalitions should be important to engage in order to make progress on this issue? And we highlighted that we should target other aspects of civil society that aren't well-versed in energy, because energy is okay. All right, so I'll jump to our recommendations. Okay. So recommendations is to introduce energy into discussions of other civil society groups. At the community level, just have this conversation being started through education. This is bad. And okay, so 2 more ideas, and then I'll be done. That there should be like a snapshot of what other communities are doing, to see that to compare how other communities are doing as that concerns to technology, so we can share ideas. And the last idea is like to have like some sort of like media campaign, like have a show that is like dramatic, but it highlights the different energy issues to make it more relatable to people's lives.
While climate comes up, could you please make sure that we have every yellow sheet filled in and up?
Hi, good. So my name is Julia, this is Adam. We're both students at the Global Engagement Program, and we're looking at goal number 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So with the first question, why should this goal be included in the Sustainable Development Goals? How many of you in this room are residents of New York City or the surrounding parts? How many of you were impacted in some way by Hurricane Sandy? A lot of people. So that's a reason. Why should climate change be an issue? Why should it be on the agenda? Whether you are a rural farmer in Uganda and your crops depend 100% on the monsoon season, or if you are living in Alaska and your livelihood depends on whether or not the tundra is frozen, if you are living in the Himalaya mountains and your livelihood also depends on the water that comes from the glaciers, it impacts everyone. If you went to the climate change march, for example, how many different groups of people were represented? Almost everyone was represented, regardless of religion, where you were from, who you were affiliated with. I even saw any type of political group that was there. There were Republicans that were marching for climate change. This impacts everyone. I was marching behind Norwegian grandmothers. They were actually from Norway, did not speak English, and they were grandmothers for sure. And they were marching for climate change. And they flew from Norway and were wearing these red capes. It affects everyone, and that's why it has to be on the agenda. So, scrolling down to the next question, which was the important targets, right? So which targets would you think were most important? So in our group, we had a lot of high school students. Half of our group were high school students. And education was a big deal for them. So one of the targets being to improve education and awareness raising. So having everyone be involved in this, including children, for the next generation to be able to understand how to live in a sustainable manner, because that is going to be important in order to continue this. We also brought up the fact that Obama, for instance, was somehow kind of emotionally changed when his daughters came home from school saying hey Dad, environment is important, that's what we learned at school today, what are you doing for policy? So it's important. We also talked about promoting mechanisms for raising capacities for effective climate change. Obviously, capacities are that's the next step. We need to build up a capacity, the ability to improve our technology in order to change society to have these policy changes. And then again, policy. Policy is very important. That is a step. If you look at the Montreal Protocol, for instance, how we were able to change really rapidly in order to combat the hole in the ozone layer, policy at the global level, that's pushed down to the national level and local level. We also talked about, so money is an important aspect to have this change. So another one of the targets is implement the commitment undertaken by developed countries. So basically mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020 in order to have also lesser developed countries able to build these capacities. So that's very important. So the next question, how do you think the targets would be applied to the United States policymaking and legislation? Right, again, since education was kind of a big focus in our group, since we had a lot of high school students, we're talking about integrating environmental studies into the school curriculums, starting in the elementary, high school, and then kind of creating a dialogue there. And policy also kind of briefly just mentioned carbon tax, for instance, subsidies. Subsidies need to be changing from oil to green technology. There is money, it just needs to be shifted around. So policy changes need to be made. Also REDD, R-E-D-D, reducing emission, deforestation, and degradation. So those type of policies need to be put in place as soon as possible right now. So the obstacles, again, so money. Money is always an obstacle, that's the number one thing. What incentives are there for people to change from living in a society where we're basing everything off of fossil fuels into greener technology, into living sustainably. So putting a cost to the environmental impacts. And we also discussed a lot having to do in like New York City, for example. The challenge comes from the large chunk is like an initial investment. People are pretty uncomfortable with that idea of putting such a large amount of money into a policy that we might not see the savings come for another decade or so. Okay, so we have to start wrapping this up. What's important? So stakeholders, who are the stakeholders? We talked about individuals, everyone. We went over this. Who is impacted by climate change? Everyone. We are all stakeholders. Whether all religious groups, all schools, businesses, multinational corporations, stakeholders. Energy companies, stakeholders. Policies, politicians. So kind of talk about everyone. And then the recommendation for action to mobilize. Again, raising awareness. We talked about education once more. So clubs in schools, getting your community involved. And then as regards to like policy, speak truth to power is always an important thing to go back to. So elections are coming up. We talked about how politicians are always going towards the next election. Speak truth to power, talk to them, tell them that we're not going to re-elect them unless they take action on this, unless they look at the SDGs, unless they decide to combat climate change, which again takes all of us to do. So yes, climate change.
Peace and justice, and please hand forward your yellow things and your, if you are a group.
To promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. That is a very broad topic, but here are some of the reasons that we have collectively decided why this should be included. So first of all, violence is unsustainable. It's harmful to society, by extension the environment. When certain people are excluded from human decency because of poverty, gender, cultural, institutional failures, corrupt justice systems, inequality flourishes in societies, which may lead in extreme cases to development of terrorism. 2, fossil fuel industry is closely linked to the organized crime industry around the world, as well as terrorism, government corruption, etc. Therefore, Goal 16 is tied directly to the sources of climate change and environmental degradation. So, in essence, what I personally realized as the last person going is that all these issues are linked in one way or another. And when we were discussing these topics, the subpoints of Goal 16, we also realized that these issues are all intertwined. And we try to take a bottom-up approach to address the very basic of what is the root cause of all these things. So, last point, why? Democracies don't go to war with each other very often. To promote peaceful societies, it is up to domestic forces to work with the international community to address peace issues. Empowerment for local populations is necessary. Power struggles make democratic governments directly or indirectly support dictatorships that violate human rights. So the targets that we focused on was 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. We focused on 16.10, the whole issue, to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. We put a lot of focus on the importance of education and the freedom and a right of every human being to access to education and information. And last but not least, to one of the issues that we also decided is a big, definite problem and part of the root cause is human trafficking. And we want to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture against children, and also the causes that affect. So, on to the next point. How do we think that these targets should be applied? United States policy. The United States, we all know, is a curious, special case. We do things differently. We are expected to be a leader. But before we can be a leader, we need to look at ourselves and our domestic policies, because what we have decided as a group is that domestic policies are reflected by our international policies. So, federal and state governments must support the work of social workers and NGOs that focus on abuse, violence, and conflict within the United States. We must respect human dignity and enforce the rule of law, which is a huge issue in this country. There is very little accountability. Police is out of control, so is our criminal justice system. It is a big issue. Domestic policymaking must support investigative journalism and freedom of the press. The press must have an incentive to cover peace and justice issues that matter. There are reports by the New York Times that the Obama administration is, in fact, not friendly to press freedom. Domestic accountability is critical. The United States must allow itself to be held accountable internationally. And to do that, the forces within the United States must be held accountable. By who? By us, the stakeholders. Peace and justice begin at home. Foreign policy must reflect our domestic politics. So as mentioned earlier, last point, disenfranchisement of marginalized groups is a threat to democracy. Immigration is a huge issue in this country that is heavily politicized and is coming up. And is a threat to peace and justice, particularly in the subjects of Goal 16. It must be viewed as a strength of the US rather than a burden, because our cultural diversity contributes to a stronger understanding of the world, and our policymaking must reflect that rather than stifle it. So how do we think that these targets should be applied to our state and city policymaking and legislation? What needs to be done? So as mentioned earlier, the state criminal justice systems must be addressed and reformed to promote rule of law and accountability. As I said, police is out of control, not only in the state, country, but also around the world. There needs to be a spread of information and awareness through state government institutions. Focus on NGO cooperation. State prison institutions focus too much on profits rather than rehabilitation and reform. We believe that decriminalizing marijuana, perhaps even legalizing it, which would cripple drug cartels, which contribute to the drug war, which has been, I believe, very ineffective. This connects to peace and justice issues, both within states and in the international community. State institutions treat human trafficking like isolated incidents when they are not. And I see that, is that halftime or do I have to wrap up? I have to wrap up. Okay, so to wrap up, before we all go to celebrate Halloween, basically, our attitude to addressing this issue is a bottom-up approach. What does that mean? That means addressing this at the very basic issue. So in schools, on college campuses, we are bombarded with flyers on a variety of issues, and it's great. But we believe that it is critical to address these issues at a much younger age. As some of the high school students that were in our group suggested, there needs to be support for investigative journalism, which are the first sort of step in exposing, which is followed by shaming of an institution that has failed, which is later followed by reform, hopefully, if all things work well. So to end, this is kind of what we believe in, is that we need to pick an issue and do more than just don't throw money at it and spread awareness. We need to get involved, whether that is autism awareness or women's rights or environmental protection. Get involved and do something about it. It's up to us.
You've been wonderful. You are wonderful. And I hope you will continue to be wonderful when you go home. And put some of these things into action, whether you're a college student, whether you live in a co-op, whether you live in Bergen County, New Jersey. We really would like to see some action come out of this. We'll put you on our mailing list and give